Chapter 8 Signal. He found the electronics shop by accident, which was how he found most things worth finding. He'd been running a different errand, a hardware store 2 blocks north of the commercial strip that he'd marked on the map as unsalvaged, meaning he hadn't been inside yet, meaning it could be anything or nothing. It was mostly nothing. Picked clean at some point by someone who'd had the same ideas he had, the shelves bare in the specific way of a place that had been visited with purpose. He found a box of assorted fasteners behind a fallen shelf unit. He found a hand drill manual, the chuck mechanism stiff but functional. He took both. On the way back, he took a different street because he always took a different street when he could. Variation as intelligence gathering, every new route was new data. The electronics shop was on a side street he hadn't mapped yet. Small, the kind of independent shop that had probably survived on repair work and niche components, wedged between a laundromat and a place that had sold insurance. The sign above the door was gone, he could see the mounting brackets where it had been, but the window, remarkably, was intact. Inside, through the dusty glass, he could see shelving units still standing. He stood outside for a moment. Then he went in. The smell hit him first, solder and dust and something else underneath, a metallic sweetness he couldn't name, but that moved through him with the particular force of a smell that meant something before you could think about what it meant. He stood just inside the door and breathed it and felt his hands, hanging at his sides, open and close once. The shelving units held components. Not everything, the glass display cases along the counter had been opened, the more valuable items taken, the empty cradles where things had sat still faintly visible through the grime. But the bulk components, the things that required knowledge to want, were still here. Resistors in labeled drawers, capacitors in bins, coils of wire of varying gauges, different from the copper spool he'd found at the pharmacy, but related to it in a way he felt rather than reasoned. Switches, terminals, a pegboard behind the counter hung with tools, small tools, precision tools, the kind that fit between your fingers rather than filling your hand. He moved through the shop slowly. His hands were doing it again. He didn't have a list. He hadn't come here with a list. He didn't have a project with defined requirements that he was sourcing components for. What he had was something more like a pull, a directional sensation that was strongest when he picked up certain things and weakest when he put them down, which was not a rational basis for salvage decisions, but which he'd learned to follow because his hands had not yet been wrong. He took a variable capacitor from the third drawer. He held it and turned it, and something in the turning felt correct. He put it in his pack. He took a coil of antenna wire, thin and flexible. A handful of resistors from the labeled drawers, selecting by a criteria he couldn't have articulated, but that felt like recognition. 2 toggle switches. A small transformer, the kind used for he picked it up, turned it over, and knew what it was used for without knowing how he knew. He set it down, he picked it up again. He put it in his pack. Behind the counter on the lowest shelf, under a collapsed display stand he had to move carefully to get to, he found the receiver chassis. Just the chassis, the guts missing, the tuning mechanism absent, the whole thing a skeleton of what it had been. But the housing was intact, the form factor correct, and when he held it in both hands the pull was so strong it was almost directional, like holding a compass. He sat on the floor behind the counter with the chassis in his lap. He had the copper wire from the pharmacy. He had the antenna wire from the drawer. He had a variable capacitor and a transformer and a collection of components selected by a method he couldn't defend and couldn't abandon. He had a hand drill and a box of fasteners. He had, in the house on Mercer Court, a workbench and tools he'd accumulated over months, and the patience of a man with nothing but time. He sat on the floor of the empty shop and looked at the chassis and felt the shape of something he didn't have a name for yet. Not the radio, he wasn't calling it that yet, just the shape, the possibility of a shape. He packed the chassis carefully, wrapping it in a strip of cloth he kept for fragile finds. He stood. He looked around the shop once more, the smell of solder, the component drawers, the pegboard of small tools. He took 3 of the tools from the pegboard. Then he left. That night he arranged everything on the workbench. He didn't work. He wasn't ready to work. He understood that without examining it, the same way you understood you weren't ready to eat something before you were hungry. He just arranged. The chassis in the center, the components around it in a loose grouping that wasn't yet organized but wasn't random either. The wire coils to the left, the transformer at the top. He stood back and looked at it. It looked like the beginning of something. He looked at it for a long time. Then he covered it with a cloth not to protect it, just because looking at it was doing something to him he wasn't ready to sustain, and went to bed. He dreamed of a voice. Not a voice saying something. Not a message, not words he could hold on to after. Just a voice, a woman's voice, warm and particular, with a specific quality of attention in it that he recognized the way you recognized a face before you remembered whose it was. She was saying his name. Not last man. He understood in the dream that this was not what his name was, had never been what his name was, but a name he couldn't hold the shape of when he reached for it. Something short. One syllable. Gone the moment he tried to look at it directly. She was laughing at something. That was the other part. The voice was warm because she was laughing, and the laughing was real, the specific unguarded realness of a person who found something genuinely funny rather than performing amusement. And in the dream he felt the sound of it the way you felt warmth from a fire, not on the surface but deeper in the chest, where things lived before they became feelings. He reached toward the voice, and the dream did what dreams do. He woke up in the gray pre-dawn light with his hand outstretched toward the empty room. He lay still for a moment. He could still hear it. Not the voice was already gone, dissolving the way voices did, but the quality of it, the warmth, the laugh. He lay still and held it as carefully as he'd held the chassis and felt it go anyway, the way everything went. He sat up. The room was the room. The house was the house. Outside the window, the suburb was doing its quiet morning thing, the birds that had come back, the wind in the trees that didn't know anything had changed, the distant nothing of the city. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The voice had known his name, not the name he moved through the wasteland with, but his name, the one underneath. He was certain of this with a certainty that had no evidence to support it and did not require any. The way you were certain of gravity, the way you were certain of cold. Someone had known his name. He got up, he made a fire, he heated water. He did the morning things in the morning order, the sequence of small acts that constituted, in the absence of anything else, a day beginning with intention. Then he went to the workbench and took the cloth off. He stood looking at the components for a long time. The chassis, the wire, the transformer, the variable capacitor that had felt correct when he turned it. He picked up the capacitor and turned it again. The feeling was still there, correct, like a word in the right place in a sentence. He picked up one of the small tools from the pegboard. He didn't know exactly what he was building yet. He knew what it needed to do. He hadn't said that to himself before, hadn't let himself say it, but standing at the workbench in the morning light with the components laid out and his hands already thinking ahead of him, he said it now, quietly, to the room. It needed to reach someone. He set the tool against the chassis and began.